Today we'll be going over Markdown, which is a way to draft plain text files so they're consistently parsable for formatting and styling. This is often used to convert like a text file into something like HTML. If you've already played with Markdown, you might skip this one, but if you haven't before, I highly encourage you look into Markdown as a quick way to draft up documentation and do some other fun things. The only prerequisite today is the option of Visual Studio Code if you want to leverage that instead of a different text editor. Created a new directory for today's exercise, opened up in Visual Studio Code. In Visual Studio Code, I'm going to be creating a new file called fruit.md, MD for Markdown. That's what we'll be going over today. All right, we've got what is effectively an empty text file, and we want to start by outlining what our document's going to be all about. We can do that with headings. To do that in Markdown, we use the pound character, and an increasing number of pound characters is a decreasing strength of heading. So for instance, we want to name the document our fruit document. We can do that through something like, pound fruit. And then any subsequent headings, we would have more pound characters. Another thing you might be interested in doing is emphasizing certain words or phrases. So for instance, you wanted to write something in italics or in bold. Markdown has that through the asterisk character. A single asterisk surrounding a word or a phrase puts it in italics. So italic versus bold, which would be double asterisk. Something like that. So then we can write something in emphasis. For instance, I'll steal the first line from Wikipedia for fruit, and we can italicize part of it, and we can bold part of it. Next, we can go over unordered lists. So this is a notion of a list that doesn't have a prioritization or a numbering scheme. We can do that, again, through the asterisk character, just asterisk space item, or we can do that through the dash. I prefer to do the dash personally because I don't want to mix up the asterisk with italics, which might occur if you have this and then some reason an item in there. So it just might read easier as you're drafting the Markdown if you stick to the dash character for that. Though some processors for Markdown might treat those differently. For now, we can create a list of fruit. And you can see that with this indent, you have sub-items. So if I do Control-Shift-V, I get to see this rendered. We have the main item in the list, and we have the sub-items, so fruit, and then underneath that is a bunch of fruit, which are not currently prioritized in any significant order. We can do an ordered list next. Ordered lists work in a very similar way, though instead of dash, it would be one dot, space, and then the word that you're putting into that list. If you wanted to do another item, you just hit enter. Visual Studio Code will do the numbering for you, but otherwise you just type 2 dot, for instance, if you're in Notepad or a browser typing this, and then you can just iterate through that. If you wanted to do sub-items to that, it's the same idea. You can just tab, and then you'll start over at 1 when you're typing it. Now we've got our clearly prioritized list, got our bullet list. Let's work on tables. Tables work a little bit differently. You have to have a header, generally. You'll want to have a header. And then you can separate those through the pipe symbol. The next thing is underneath your header, you'll have to have just a dash with white space. You can have a series of dashes if you prefer, but at least one dash separated by pipes for as many as you have headings. If you want to make it readable, you might use some tabs and spaces to get that in alignment with the heading. But then, within the next row, you can do things like item, and you still have to have as many pipes. So the piping is really consistent. That's really important. But that will give us header and a item within that. And if we render that with Control-Shift-V, we see we've got a table here. You can have as many headings and items as you feel will render properly, but that's how you do a table. Let's talk about links. Links are done through hard brackets followed by parentheses. So we can put a word such as Google, and then we can put a link such as google.com. And the way that this renders is it shows Google in most Markdown processors. It'll show Google, and then it'll be a hyperlink so you can click it, and this will be the link. So if I Control-Shift-V, go to the bottom, we see Google, and if I click that, it'll go to Google. You can also render a link through what's called reference syntax. So this is inline, whereas reference syntax means at the bottom of your document, you have this running list of links. So this is the Google site. And you can then do colon followed by the link. And instead of doing this parentheses, I can instead refer to the reference. So this will then apply that link from down here up here. So at the bottom of our document, we can have a list of links and we can refer to them throughout the rest of the document. You can also use backticks to do code snippets. So for instance, I want to demonstrate Markdown within a Markdown document. I can do that. I can say, hey, this is fruit. And instead of this being processed as a heading, when I process it, it just prints that out, and it does a subtle gray background. So you might not be able to see it here, but it does a subtle gray background, and it'll give it a slightly different font. So you get this notion, oh, this is a code snippet. You can use as many backticks as you want, so long as you're consistent. And it's a little bit of a standard syntax to do triple backticks when you're doing multi-line. So for instance, I could write JSON in here, right? I could say name, value, and this is JSON. It'll print out with that gray background, different font. But you could also specify on this first line what it is, and it'll be styled as though it is JSON. You can do this for a bunch of different languages. You can do C#, you can do JSON, you can do Markdown. You can indicate that, and then when it's processed, it'll share that styling of the language that you specified. Sometimes you'll see this where code snippets, backticks are used for emphasis rather than actual code snippets. Technically, that's valid and will parse. It will look styled different, so there is emphasis that's occurring there. Other than that, I've done an inline link to the fruit Wikipedia page. You can also use this inline link syntax with an exclamation in front of it in order to have an image processed into the document. So for instance, if I wanted to have my logo in there, and I know my logo is hosted right here on this URL, I can just apply that. And if I go to it now, hey, Non-Zero Days is there. I've got our finished Markdown on the right here. And if you push it up to GitHub, a neat feature that GitHub has is if you navigate into a Markdown file, you see it processed. And that's super cool. That means if you want to, you can write documentation, simple, like this, just a text file. And when you upload that with all of your code, you've got some pretty cleanly formatted documentation that others can look at. And you can even link to a section. So for instance, now I've got a URL that goes directly to the list, right? These headings become linkable. And further, there's a neat little feature. You can use those headings as a table of contents and just navigate directly to them. This kind of functionality is pretty helpful, I think. Today we went over Markdown. We showed that with Markdown, we're able to take a text file, add a few characters to it, and have it be processable through things like GitHub or Visual Studio Code into a formatted, well-organized document that includes things like headings, emphasis, lists, tables, links, images, code snippets. And with this, I encourage you to go out and document your projects, document just your one-offs. It even helps for like self-organizing, just writing your own notes for what are you doing today, or what are your goals. This is also the nature of how we did things like GitHub profiles. So I think, I really encourage you to go out and play with Markdown and use it. Keep yourself organized, keep your projects organized. And if you have the time, you might check out down below. I've got additional resources, which is a Markdown cheat sheet, which shows some optional stuff that some processors will treat as valid Markdown and can be quite powerful. Otherwise, just congratulations on a non-zero day.